Scotland and Ireland are two of the best known whiskey producing countries in the world. But despite being neighbors, they have some fundamental differences in the way they make their products. In this video, we're going to talk about the differences between Irish whiskey and Scottish whiskey. And perhaps most interestingly, we're also going to give you the opportunity to win 5 of the best Irish whiskeys. We're talking about the Redbreast Lustau, 12-year-old cask strength, 15-year-old, and 21-year-old. Stick around until the end of the videos, and we'll tell you how to win all 5 Redbreast expressions. If this is your first time watching a Top Whiskeys video, where have you been? We do whiskey videos like this every week, and we give away free bottles of whiskey every month. Make sure you click the subscribe button so you don't miss out. So the first difference is probably the most obvious difference. Is it whiskey or whiskey? You pronounce them the same way. I probably sound like an idiot. Is it whiskey with an E or is it whiskey without an E? In Scotland, it's without an E. In Ireland, it has an E. Why? It's a good question, because the word whiskey comes from the Gaelic word úsgaba, which is exceptionally difficult to pronounce. Both Irish people and Scottish people speak Gaelic, so they wouldn't have the same kind of pronunciation problems that I do. So why then would they decide to spell whiskey with an E or without an E? It's not necessarily clear, but one of the main theories is that in Ireland, they have very different production methods. Hence, this video and probably your interest in watching this video. And because they're different in Ireland, they wanted to show that their product is different. So they started to add an E to whiskey in order to show that their whiskey is different than Scottish whiskey. In the 1970s, you'd see probably whiskey with and without an E used interchangeably. But right now, it's pretty clear, whiskey with an E, whiskey without an E. And why? Why not? Next is about production, and let's start with really basic production. Scotch whiskey comes from malted barley that's been distilled in a copper still and matured in a cask for a minimum of 3 years. Irish whiskey comes from unmalted barley, which has been distilled in a copper still and matured for 3 years. So on a very basic level, the main difference is that in Scotland, they're using malted barley, in Ireland, they're using unmalted barley. Let's get into a bit more detail about distillation and malting. In Scotland, as I said, most of it is coming from malted barley. That's a Scottish single malt, 100% malted barley. They can use other grains and they can use blends. So something like Johnny Walker is a blend of malted barley and some combination of other grains. But typically you're talking about malted barley. The next important differentiator of Scotch whiskey is that it goes through a copper still twice, only 2 times. This means that it keeps some of its robustness. Now you can compare that to Irish whiskey, which is typically distilled 3 times. So going through a copper still, but 3 times. By going through 3 times, it gets a lot smoother and more refined. And that's why one of the key tasting notes for an Irish whiskey is its smoothness. And that's not something that you see as much with Scotch whiskey. And obviously, there are exceptions on both sides, but generally speaking, Scotch whiskey tends to be a bit more robust because it's distilled twice, and Irish whiskey tends to be smoother because it's distilled 3 times, generally speaking. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the grain used in Irish whiskey. So as I said before, for the most part, Scotch whiskey, certainly single malt, single malted barley, fine. It gets a bit more complicated and I'd say arguably more interesting. Feel free to disagree, write comments below, but I like that in Ireland they start to play with a lot of different things when it comes to the grains they use. So it's not at all uncommon in Ireland to be using things other than malted barley. In fact, that's the entire concept of the whole new category that Ireland invented called single pot still. Now, single pot still whiskey is made from a combination of malted and unmalted barley. Single pot still actually grew out of taxation. And I find that I talk about taxation a lot on this channel, which, is focused on whiskey. And the story of whiskey and taxation somehow tend to go together really closely. Interesting fact. The reason that they came out with single pot still whiskey was as a way to avoid paying taxes. They had to pay taxes to use malted barley, but they didn't have to pay any taxes to use unmalted barley, which is where the tradition came from. And the quintessential strong flavor of a single pot still whiskey is Redbreast. But there are loads of other ones that actually do it to different degrees and in really interesting ways. Middleton's Method in Madness, for example, is a really interesting range that's using pot still whiskeys in experimental and challenging ways that produce flavors that you're not really seeing. Okay. So we've said that one of the keys to Irish whiskey is the variation in the type of grain that's being used. And where Scotland tries to get the edge on being able to do things differently is when it comes to the stills. In Scotland, there are loads of different weird and wonderful shaped stills. And you get small ones, tall ones, fat ones, skinny ones, all these different kinds of stills. A typical example might be Glenmorangie. You see these really tall, beautiful stills. But most of the stills in Ireland tend to be these pot stills, which are smaller, squat, more uniform. Interesting thing about the stills in Scotland, they are so distinctive and so important to the flavor that if they have to replace a still, they will do a like for like copy. I'm not just talking about they take the same plans and they send it off to a company and say, make this still with the same dimensions. We're talking about if it has a dent in it, something like that, even like a small, tiny crack inside of the still, they want to try to replicate those things because they want the still to be exactly the same. We've talked a lot about the differences between Irish whiskey and Scottish whiskey, but it's probably worth touching on the things they have in common. Because from the way I've described it, you'd think they were completely separate products. But actually, they have one of the most important things in common, and that's wood. Both Irish whiskey and Scottish whiskey are matured in oak barrels, or at least about 70% of all whiskey from those countries goes into oak barrels. And those barrels tend to either be ex-bourbon barrels or ex-sherry barrels. And you get a lot of flavor from the wood. So a bourbon barrel will give sort of those kind of banana, vanilla notes. An ex-sherry barrel will give sweet notes to it. And no matter what your production method, if it's tall, skinny stills, if it's using malted and unmalted barley, as soon as you take that final product and you put it into an oak barrel, that oak barrel is going to have a huge impact. If you're looking for sort of a crossover, it might be worth checking out Oakentoshan, which is a triple distilled Scottish whiskey that tastes a lot like an Irish whiskey. And alternatively, Teeling Single Cask produces a whiskey that's very Scottish in its style. It has a lot of depth and complexity that you tend to find from Scottish whiskeys. And it's interesting to sort of try those two and see what difference they make or how they go together. I hope that you found this video interesting, talking at a high level about some of the differences between Irish and Scottish whiskey, but the best way to be able to experience it is to try for yourself. And fortunately, I have a really easy way that you can try an entire range of whiskey for yourself. Head over to Dream Whiskey's website. We're giving away free bottles of Redbreast 21, Redbreast 15, Redbreast 12 cask strength, Redbreast 12 original, and Lustau. And it's dead easy to enter. All you need to do is head over to the website. You can sign up for the mailing list. You can tweet about the competition. You can share it with your friends. One of the benefits of sharing it with your friends is that your friends can enter, but also you get entries because you referred your friends. Check it out. This is such a cool prize and will be such an amazing thing for you to be able to experience. I hope that you do win. If you don't win, that's okay too, because we do free whiskey giveaways every month. So make sure you click the subscribe button so you don't miss out. And thanks for watching this video.